Comic books are political. Whether you like it or not, comic book authors are either implicitly or explicitly injecting their own political biases into your favorite comic book stories. Sometimes these messages can be incredibly powerful, and other times they can be downright disgusting. However, when people think about political messaging in superhero comics, I'm sure that the X-Men is a cast of characters that pops into a lot of people's minds. If you look at modern comics like the Krakoa era of X-Men, you'll see the X-Men living in their own nation state. The comics from this era shows us the X-Men with a governing body, state sovereignty, a global task force, and so many other highbrow concepts that are inseparable from politics. If you jump into the early 2000s and look at something like Grant Morrison's New X-Men, you'll read a comic in which the second issue shows you the mutants dealing with the ramifications of a literal genocide. Go back to the Claremont era of X-Men and these stories were dripping with textual symbolism. God Loves, Man Kills, Days of Future Past, the Dark Phoenix Saga, and so many other iconic Claremont stories constantly provided commentary about socio-political topics like discrimination, religious fundamentalism, the violence of law and order, and so much more. And if you want to go all the way back to the start with X-Men #1, while yes, Stan Lee didn't create the X-Men to represent the civil rights movement, as the X-Men grew in popularity, a lot of fans saw that parallel, and Stan Lee seemed to agree with the parallel. Point being, the X-Men comics have always had political themes integrated into their stories. The thing is, most people would agree that the X-Men didn't become what they were until 1975 with Giant Size X-Men #1. This story by Len Wein and Dave Cockrum introduced new vital characters to the team and sold well enough to make the general public interested in the X-Men. But alongside popularizing the X-Men comic line, Giant Size X-Men did something that I think often gets overlooked today. Without Giant Size X-Men, X-Men comics and perhaps the comic industry as a whole would look a whole lot different. So join me in this video as we talk about the enduring politics of the X-Men and how Giant Size X-Men defined the politics of the X-Men. But first, a little bit of background. Prior to the release of Giant Size X-Men, X-Men comics were in a lull. The books were selling decently, but there were no new X-Men stories. Rather, X-Men comics in the 70s were actually just reprints of older stories. For better or for worse, X-Men comics had been sidelined. But in the 70s, Marvel was interested in expanding its reach by potentially tapping into foreign markets, and the X-Men seemed like a perfect group of characters to do that with. In an interview that former Marvel editor-in-chief Roy Thomas did with Fantagraphics, Thomas spoke about the fact that in the 70s, Marvel came to this realization after meeting with the CEO of a company who was selling Marvel comics overseas. This is when Stan Lee and Roy Thomas were told that Marvel, quote, Marvel had big markets in 3 or 4 countries, and if they had a team with 3 or 4 characters in it, one from each country, they would have a terrific hit on their hands overseas. So the new X-Men was actually born to tap into our foreign market. So of course, Roy Thomas then came up with an idea to capitalize off this, with Thomas saying that, quote, my original idea was that a couple members like Cyclops and Marvel Girl, with the others guest starring occasionally, would have this giant ship, sort of a Noah's Ark thing, that they would fly around with a portable cloud around it and would hover over various countries in search of a different X-Men that would get them into adventures. Now, while all these conversations were happening behind the scenes, a little known author by the name of Len Wein was actually writing Incredible Hulk comics. And according to Wein, he wanted to create a new character who could fight the Hulk. And on July 2nd, 1974, Incredible Hulk issue 180 was released, and audiences were introduced to the character of Wolverine. According to Wein, he knew that Marvel was looking for new international characters to star in the X-Men, so Wein made Wolverine a Canadian mutant. So if Marvel wanted to use this character in their project, they could. Unfortunately, at this point, things got a little muddy. Thomas never committed to fully scripting the story and eventually stepped down as Marvel editor-in-chief. Wein later took Thomas's place as editor-in-chief, and in the process of taking over the role, Wein also inherited the X-Men project. And so, in February of 1975, Len Wein and Dave Cockrum's Giant Size X-Men hit shelves, changing the comic book landscape forever. But what was Giant Size X-Men? Well, the plot was actually fairly standard as far as comic books go. The issue opens up by showing us this lineup of new international X-Men, with the silhouette of the old X-Men team shimmering behind them. In page 2, we see the origins of Kurt Wagner, aka Nightcrawler. In these pages, we see Nightcrawler running around a German town in the Bavarian Alps as a mob of fearful and violent residents chase Kurt through the village. village. The mob is disgusted by the appearance of Kurt to the point where they're willing to destroy the village in order to kill Kurt. We then see the mob capture Kurt. They drag him to the ground, raising their stakes in the air, ready to stab him through the heart. But right before they end his life, the mob freezes in place and Professor X appears. Professor X tells Kurt about his school for mutants and offers to help Kurt find his potential. And of course, Kurt accepts the offer and joins the X-Men. This is an incredibly bold start to the book, and also a ridiculously powerful way to introduce the reader to Nightcrawler. Within the first few pages of this book, Len Wein and Dave Cockrum illustrate the core idea that defines the X-Men, and that is the fact that mutantdom is an analogy for oppression, whether that be violent instances of discrimination or more subtle instances where otherization causes people to view them as subhuman. Point being, the mutant metaphor in Giant Size X-Men is clear. And while Stan Lee stated that his X-Men comics dealt with these topics, Giant Size X-Men was the re-establishment of X-Men after a long hiatus. This choice cemented these topics as thematically linked to the team in an undeniable way. But alongside this very obvious ideological messaging, there's also some subtext within these pages that I think is often overlooked, and that is the fact that Nightcrawler's point of origin is German. In 1975, Germany was split into two distinct states. First was East Germany, also known as the German Democratic Republic. East Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union, making it a central part of the Soviet Union's Eastern Bloc. And because Germany was occupied by the Soviets, it's no surprise that East Germany was also governed via socialist principles. Meanwhile, the other side of Germany was known as West Germany, aka the Federal Republic of Germany. Unlike East Germany, West Germany was formerly occupied by the United States, and while West Germany had complete independence in 1975, it was still a pivotal ally to the United States and remained heavily militarized by United States troops in order to prevent Soviet expansion. And in 1975, the United States was in the midst of the Cold War. If you're unaware, the Cold War was a decades-long ideological battle between the Soviet Union and the United States. During this period, there was never any direct conflict between the United States and the USSR. Rather, the United States maintained a position that advocated for the expansion of Western hegemony across the globe via the proliferation of capitalist ideals, while the Soviet Union held the inverse of that position as they pushed for the rise of communism throughout the world, all of which to say the Cold War was a geopolitical conflict that both East and West Germany played a major role in. At the time Giant Size X-Men released in 1975, American politicians were staunchly against the East German state. The 37th President Richard Nixon and the 38th President Gerald Ford expressed public criticisms towards the Eastern Bloc and made it clear that Germany ought to be unified in a single state that utilized Western values of governance. It's also very clear that Western media during this time aimed to showcase East Germany as a totalitarian and inherently oppressive land, while the media depicted West Germany as a prosperous and free nation. And then in comes Nightcrawler, a character from Germany, more specifically the Bavarian Alps, which is located in the Federal Republic of Germany, aka West Germany. Now, I want you to think back to Roy Thomas's initial mission statement for what Giant Size X-Men was supposed to be. The point of Giant Size X-Men was to introduce an international team that could sell well in foreign markets. Now I want you to think about Nightcrawler. He is from West Germany, a nation that is supposed to represent the triumphs of Western values. And within the first few pages of this book, the generalized idea of what West Germany traditionally represents in Western media is thrown out the window. West Germany isn't shown to be this prosperous, tolerant, forward-thinking nation. Instead, it's shown to be violently bigoted. And in my opinion, this depiction of West Germany, intentional or not, makes a political statement, because in America, both lawmakers and media outlets unilaterally showed support for West Germany. Wein's book did not do that. Rather, it pushed against the grain, ignoring the US-centered political biases, basically telling the audience that bigotry is a concept that transcends borders. All of which to say, do you think showing West Germany in a less favorable light would help achieve Thomas's goal of marketing X-Men towards international markets? Because I don't think so. For obvious reasons, I'm sure you can guess that Germans are quite sensitive when it comes to being portrayed as an intolerant contemporary nation, and Giant Size X-Men #1 shows Germany, even if only briefly, as a very intolerant nation. These people are so violent violent that they literally would destroy their own town to kill this one mutant. I don't think this characterization of German people would appeal to the German market, meaning that within the first 4 pages of Giant Size X-Men, Len Wein and Dave Cockrum did 2 crucial things. First, they cemented the mutant metaphor by drawing an undeniable analogy for discrimination via the physical manifestation of Nightcrawler's mutation. And second, they either explicitly or inadvertently pushed back against the American geopolitical status quo by framing the backdrop of West Germany as a vile and depraved place, making it so that Nightcrawler's first appearance is irrevocably tied to the Cold War era politics of détente. Important to note, I couldn't find any specific statements that Wein made about Nightcrawler's origin, but I did find in one interview that Dave Cockrum did with Fantagraphics where he mentioned that the team was fascinated with the idea of détente, meaning that even if they didn't make the active political decision to portray West Germany in the way they did, they were at least aware of these political tensions, meaning if it wasn't an active decision, it was probably a subconscious one. And I think it's so fascinating that the portrayal of West Germany is so against the grain, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, because immediately after this, the narrative and politics of the book continues to unravel, as in the next few pages we're introduced to the one and only Wolverine. Real quick, if you're enjoying this video so far, make sure to drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe. It goes a long way when it comes to helping out the channel. Anyways, Wolverine's intro happens in Quebec, Canada. It's revealed that Wolverine is an agent of the Canadian government. Professor X shows up to this secret government facility in Canada and also reveals that he was impressed with Wolverine's skills because Professor X was aware of Wolverine's encounter with the Hulk. Professor X then tells Wolverine that he knows Wolverine is a mutant and offers Wolverine the opportunity to become a free agent by joining him. Wolverine gleefully accepts the gig and runs off with Professor X. What we learn from this scene is that Wolverine is a Canadian and works for the Canadian government in a militaristic capacity. There's not as much subtext in this scene like there is with Nightcrawler's introduction, so I'm not going to analyze the geopolitical positioning of the Canadian government in this story, but I do think it's worth noting that Wolverine is seen as a utility. Professor X recruits Nightcrawler by saving him. He offers Nightcrawler an opportunity to be in a safe space and seek out his true potential. When trying to recruit Wolverine, Professor X is a little more blunt. He literally says, "You, my friend, are a mutant, and I have a need of mutants. Desperate need." It's really important to highlight the wording here because it establishes not only who Professor X is, but also how Wolverine views himself. If you've read more contemporary X-Men comics, you'll know that Professor X is far from a perfect person. In my opinion, the core thesis that defines Professor X's character is that he is a man who has good intentions, but in the process of getting to his end goal, he views his allies as tools rather than people, which can be very dangerous. When you adopt this utilitarian mindset, you lose touch with a part of humanity, at least in my opinion. And the way Professor X talks to Wolverine here is very telling. It's reflective of the character he will become decades later. He's looking at Wolverine and viewing Wolverine as nothing more than a tool to help him achieve his goals. Now, obviously, Len Wein didn't know the character arc Professor X would go down, but it's interesting that the character Professor X would become can be found, if only briefly, in the pages of this story. Then there's Wolverine. He has no problem with Xavier's framework because he views himself in that same light. It's a toxic mindset in which you view your own value through the lens of utility, and I think it's also really fascinating because it's telling of what Wolverine would become. When we think about Wolverine, we think about a character who's rageful, violent, and focused on nothing else but the mission. And in the first few pages of this story, we kind of get that. So shout out to Len Wein. This book doesn't contain the first appearance of either Wolverine or Professor X, but it does plant the seeds of what their characters would eventually become. So as Wolverine joins the team, Professor X's mission continues, and we're introduced to a brand new character known as Storm. In page 8, we're thrown into Kenya. We see a bunch of men climbing a tall knoll in order to meet with a goddess. Her name, Storm. They tell her that there is a drought and they're in desperate need of water and they're willing to sacrifice their animals to her if it guarantees a storm, to which Storm replies by saying, "Save your beasts, you need them more than I do." She then uses her powers, bringing rain upon the land and giving the men the water they desperately need to save their crops. As you can probably guess, right after this moment, Professor X comes up to Storm and courts her to join the X-Men. Storm is the first person of color we meet in this story. She is a black African woman, making her one of the first black protagonists in Marvel Comics in general. Before Storm, there was Blade, who debuted in 1963, Luke Cage, who debuted in 1972, and of course, T'Challa, who debuted in 1966. 1966. You might notice these are all men, because Storm is the first leading black female protagonist in Marvel Comics, and that is a huge deal. I couldn't find any data to specifically pinpoint the race and gender distribution of comic book fans, but I don't think it's far-fetched to say that in the 70s, the vast majority of comic book readers were likely white men. So putting an African woman into a comic book as a leading character is a risk. Because when you introduce audiences to a character from a foreign background, you risk alienating consumers because people are comfortable with familiarity. Kenya is not something Western audiences were familiar with, so you have to give Len Wein props for wanting to include a character from a backdrop that is so far removed from the perspective of the average comic book fan. Storm would then go on to become one of the most popular and important members on the X-Men. X-Men comics wouldn't be what they are today without her, and there's another argument to make in that I don't think comics would be as diverse as they are today if not for Storm. So huge respect to Wein for making the decision to put this character in the pages of giant size X-Men. This is also especially interesting when you look at the status quo for black people in America, both in context to policing and media representation. In 1971, Nixon spoke to Congress declaring a war on drugs. Nixon passed drug policies that aimed to criminalize the use of controlled substances like heroin, marijuana, and cocaine, with drug laws that focused heavily on penalization via long sentences of incarceration. We now know decades after the fact that the ramifications of these policies were disastrous for African Americans, as US policing disproportionately targeted black Americans. According to a 1996 declassified interview from former White House counsel John Ehrlichman, Nixon's administration knew this would happen, with Ehrlichman saying that, quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news." What I've said so far is a drastic oversimplification of the war on drugs and doesn't begin to capture the immense negative consequences these policies had towards marginalized groups. I suggest you do your own research into this topic to truly grasp how significant the war on drugs was. Point being, in the 70s, there were targeted campaigns from the federal government that would criminalize black bodies. And in the pages of a comic book that was presumably read by a mostly white audience, you had a leading black protagonist. Even if this book does absolutely nothing to address the socio-political climate, the distillation of positive representation goes a very, very long way, especially in a time where you didn't have the internet and all your news came from mainstream media. Because when you read a newspaper or you turn on the TV and you see a massive number of black folks getting locked up, being labeled as criminals, that will influence the way you think about black people, especially when you're a white American that lives in an area with no other people of color. And that is why a character like Storm is such a vital piece of representation. Seeing positive representation helps people unpack their own internal biases. All that being said, Storm is still an African woman written from the perspective of a white American man, and there is still a large number of stereotypes and tropes that are used to characterize the backdrop of Africa. The 1970s was a deeply transformative era for Kenya's social, political, and economic development. In 1963, Kenya had gained independence from the United Kingdom, meaning the governing body of Kenya was in its adolescent phase. In 1975, Jomo Kenyatta would have been the president of Kenya, and his policies were quite favorable to the neoliberal Western order. Kenyatta was against nationalization, maintained a positive trade relationship with the British, and advocated for capitalist expansion. Point being, Kenya's emerging government structure was positioned as a young but pro-capitalist ally to the West. During the Cold War, a time where political allegiance to Western ideals determined a country's favorability, Kenya's president Kenyatta was also caught in a scandal where he launched programs to buy back previously colonially owned property, with the goal of redistributing that property to those whom which it was stolen from, including Kenyan tribes. However, Kenyatta's application of this plan ended up favoring the political elite, as people close to him were usually the primary benefactors of these buyback programs. There were over 40 different types of tribes in Kenya at the time, from a variety of different backgrounds and cultures, and it was these tribes who helped fight the British for independence in the 60s. Point being, Kenya's political systems were complex. It was defined by colonization, resistance, and corruption. And the sad part is that the tribal perspective is the one that was continually disenfranchised. And then in this book, you see a tribal group in Kenya running around begging Storm for help. help, the nuance of Kenya's complex history is nowhere to be found. You would look at this portrayal of Kenya and think, that's all it is, a group of tribal folk running around in the jungle, which is kind of accurate, but also very misleading. It's a simplistic, primitive portrayal of tribal relations that feeds into a Western stereotype that otherizes Africans by framing them as backwards and powerless victims. And while I don't blame Wein for this characterization, I do think it's important to showcase the actual history of Kenya and compare that to the dulled down backdrop we see in this book to showcase how Western representation of foreign lands often removes nuance in favor of exotically problematic depictions. Like I said, Kenyan tribes were a large reason for Kenya's independence. They fought hard, and when the time finally came for land redistribution, a lot of them were denied what they were owed. They were powerful, hardworking folks with a deep commitment to their land, but reading this book, you're not going to see that depiction, and you wouldn't realize any of this. All of which goes to show why Storm is such a fascinating character. When you look at the war on drugs and see the value of black representation in a media where people like that were underrepresented, you have to recognize the value of her character. But in that same vein, the way in which they showcase her origins feeds into negative stereotypes. It's a double-edged sword that highlights why nuance and critical thinking is especially valuable. And then, after meeting Storm, we move on to another character, Colossus. On page 10, we meet a young but humongous Russian boy from Siberia named Peter Rasputin. When we meet Peter, he is an agricultural worker in the fields of a collectivist farm. We see him use his powers to save his sister, and then Professor X pops up, telling Peter he needs to use his powers for the betterment of the world. And Peter, while reluctant to leave his family, joins Professor X on his mission. Something we've talked about a lot during this video is the Cold War, and the heightened tension between the United States and Russia. Storm's background from Africa and Nightcrawler's background from West Germany both touch on this, but Peter is a literal Russian. His character embodies this conflict both figuratively and literally. And what's really important to understand is that Peter is framed as a wholehearted person. He joins Professor X because he believes that he can make the world a better place, which seems like a wholehearted character trait. But when you look at the way Western media framed Russian folks, you'll realize this was very against the grain. Some of the most impactful Hollywood blockbusters from the 80s and 70s feature Russian characters who are disproportionately the antagonist of the film. American media was basically priming Western audiences to look at Russian people and make them view Russians as the villain. And it wasn't just Hollywood, it was the news media too. Western news agencies often report on Russia by focusing on the growing threat of escalation, almost never highlighting the cultural aspects of Russia, nor focusing on the voices of Russian people. So the idea that an American comic is taking a character from a background that is constantly demonized by Western media, but is instead showcasing that person to be a kind-hearted soul is radical. And as mentioned earlier, Dave Cockrum did say that the writers' room were fascinated with Dayton, meaning this had to be an intentional choice. As I mentioned earlier, Thomas's initial plans for this new X-Men team was to cater the characters to foreign markets, but Russia was not a major source of American exports. In fact, the Soviet Union banned the distribution of Western print media. There was no commercial benefit to including Colossus as a character in these books, but there was every reason for them to frame him as a cliché Russian villain, and yet Peter is an incredible person. He's a kind soul who follows his conscience and fights for what is right. And in a Western media landscape that is dominated by villainous depictions of Russians, this type of characterization goes a long way. And then, right after Colossus, we meet a new addition to the team, Thunderbird. On page 13, we're thrown back into America, more specifically Camp Verde, Arizona, as we watch as John Proudstar, an Apache warrior, chases down a bison. Professor X approaches Proudstar and tells him that he is needed, to which Proudstar responds, "The white man needs me? That's tough. I owe him nothing but the grief he's given to my people. Now beat it." Professor X responds by rage baiting him and saying that, quote, "Then perhaps what they say is true. Perhaps the Apache are all frightened and selfish children." And that right there is enough to get John Proudstar to join the team. It's kind of ridiculous and also insane that Professor X rage baits a Native American to join the team by touting racist propaganda, and it definitely makes you do a double take. But you have to remember, after all, this is a comic book written by a white man. But what's even more interesting is that in 1975, they were coming off the heels of Nixon's administration, which had a lot of problems. The war on drugs, as we mentioned earlier, Watergate, and Nixon's impeachment were all negative markings on his time in the executive office. But one thing that I stumbled upon doing this research that I was shocked about was Nixon's ongoing commitment to the Native American people. Nixon was president during a time where civil rights activism was on the rise, and Nixon had a policy of preferring to listen to and address the concerns of Native Americans. Nixon became the first president ever to sign a bill in 1970 that would give land back to the Native American people. The Taos Pueblo community was returned land in New Mexico, the Yakima tribe was returned land in Washington, and the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was passed in 1972 that returned 4.5 million acres to the Alaskan people and also included a payment of $962.5 million. Nixon also passed the Indian Education Act in 1972, which helped fund Native American education programs via federal funding and scholarships. And Nixon was a proponent of Native American self-determinism, and he believed that, quote, Indians can become independent of federal control without being cut off from federal concern and federal support. Nixon was a terribly racist person who criminalized black bodies to a degree in which we are still suffering the systemic ramifications of today. But there's a very real argument to be made that Nixon might be the most progressive president in regards to Native American policies. By the 1970s, Native American representation was also becoming more visible in Western media. They still fell into the noble savage trope, in which they were shown to be harmonious with nature and filled with idealistic intentions. It was a type of innocence that subtly supported the idea that Native Americans were primitive figures who were wholehearted but in need of saving via modernization. And Proudstar's representation lies somewhere in the middle. It's positive in the sense that any form of representation is a step forward, but it's negative in the sense that it does in fact rely on the noble savage trope in some way. The use of Proudstar in this book is fascinating because it's not as radical as some of the other examples, but once again, when looking at the political confines of the time, the context shows us how Proudstar as a character is emblematic of a broader social shift when it comes to Native American representation and Native American policy. Overall, every single new X-Men character in this book comes from a background that isn't the United States, and that's really important because, like I've said a lot, diverse examples of representation are vital when it comes to shifting the social paradigm. But in that same vein, the lack of contextual nuance can make it so that some of these examples of representation are far from perfect. I think it's really easy to say that X-Men comics are progressive and forward-thinking stories that represent marginalized people, because yeah, that is true, but when having this conversation, we often overlook the fact that the politics found in some of these initial comics aren't always positive. Giant Size X-Men was very forward-thinking in the fact that it introduced audiences to a multicultural team. But in that same vein, these books perpetuated some negative stereotypes, like we discussed earlier, all of which to say, the moralism of your favorite stories aren't always black and white. As audiences, it's important to appreciate expansions in representation, like we see in Giant Size X-Men, while also recognizing some of the negative stereotypes. So if you're someone who feverishly celebrated the politics of X-Men comics, I hope this video helped you reframe your mindset, because honestly, I used to be that person too. I thought the X-Men were woke and based, and I parroted that point for a very long time. But truthfully, after reading these stories, I realized yes, they are undoubtedly political, but it's a little more nuanced than that. And if you're someone who doesn't like to engage in the politics of comics, I hope this helped change your mind, because politics are everywhere. Whether it's intentional or not, your favorite author is putting political messages into their story, and it's up to you as the reader to decipher that message using historical and social context, just like I did in this video. If you guys are interested in buying collected edition comics like X-Men, make sure to check out the channel sponsor Panelbound Comics. It's a website where you can buy comic book collected editions for up to 50% off, and you can use my code YOUHOO on checkout to save even more money. And if you like me and are looking for more content by me, make sure to check out the podcast Crash Out Comics with my good buddies. It's where we just talk about all things comics, and if you like what I have to say in this video, I think you'll enjoy the podcast as well. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I'll catch y'all in the next one.